I'll tell you a strange story that happened to me. I live in a regular apartment building on the 6th floor, with windows overlooking the courtyard. Last autumn I was at home on leave and got into the habit of drinking tea by the window, watching the sunset behind the houses. That seemingly harmless habit helped me notice something strange. Watching the sunset all the time soon bored me, so I began to study the courtyard, the nearby houses, and so on. One evening, when the sun had already disappeared behind the buildings and didn't glare into my eyes, I noticed in one of the windows across the yard a figure with an oval white face. Someone else was watching the courtyard from the 4th floor. The next day, at the same time, while I was having tea, I saw the figure again and looked at it more closely. From what I could tell, a child sat at the window. The proportions and some details suggested that. I watched as kids played football in the yard below. Then dusk thickened, and I could no longer make out the little silhouette. Notably, the light in that window and in the neighboring windows never turned on when night came. On the 3rd day, my gaze unconsciously searched for the silhouette in the window, and there it was again. I remembered that during all my observations the child had not moved even once. Something about it disturbed me. Its eyes. Of course I couldn't see them from such a distance, but where the eyes should have been there lay unpleasant, frightening shadows, as if not eyes, but voids. In the deepening twilight, it would have been easy to blame it on a trick of the light. On the 4th day, I wasn't home. On the 5th, I asked a neighbor for his binoculars. After sunset, the figure still stood motionless, but through the binoculars, it seemed blurred. Apparently, the child sat not directly at the window, but a little back from it. However, after I looked with the binoculars, it seemed to me that those black voids, where the eyes should be, were staring exclusively at me. I began to draw the curtain and drink tea in another room, trying not to think about it, but curiosity gnawed at me. And the next day I peeked from behind the curtain. The figure was still there. I remind you, the light in that window hadn't once been switched on. Not in the evening, not at night, not in the morning. All this alarmed me greatly. I don't even know why, but I went downstairs and started walking in front of the neighboring house, secretly peeking at the strange windows. From the street, the windows only reflected the evening sky. Bored, I tried to figure out which apartment number those windows belonged to. It turned out to be apartment number 16. My feet carried me to the entrance. I froze at the intercom, not daring to press the button. The feeling that I was acting foolishly fought with my curiosity. Just then the door opened. An elderly couple came out of the building. I took that as a sign, greeted the old people politely, and slipped inside. Going up to the 4th floor, I invented a cover story in case someone opened the apartment door. It'd say it mixed up entrances, that I'd come to look at an apartment for sale. At the door with the number 16 I hesitated a bit, examined it, and, for some reason, pulled the handle. The door opened. It wasn't locked. Like in a dream, a black opening of the apartment stood before me. I considered myself a brave person. I'd been in unpleasant places before and had encountered strange things, but here I felt a peculiar apprehension I could not recall ever having felt. I realized I might not be able to go in, wanting to attract less attention and trying not to let my mind invent an excuse to retreat. I entered the apartment with my arms stretched out in front. I had to close the door behind me. The layout was strange. I groped along the hallway wall for a light switch and found one quickly, but the light did not come on. Apparently, there was no electricity. For the same reason, the doorbell didn't work either. Feeling my way, I moved toward the rooms. First, I peeked into a large living room. It was brighter there. The windows weren't curtained and let in a little light. The room was absolutely empty. Floor, ceiling, walls with torn wallpaper, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. My footprints showed clearly in it. It looked abandoned. I realized a mysterious silhouette must be in the far room, which a small corridor led to, alongside the bathroom and the toilet. I returned to the hallway and carefully crept into that corridor. As luck would have it, the bedroom door was slightly ajar, and I was wound up to the highest tension, ready to meet any horror behind it. With an unpleasant creak, I opened the door and stepped inside. No one was there, the same torn walls, and a cord hanging from the ceiling. But by the window stood a child's writing desk, fairly old, the kind rarely made anymore, often bought for first graders. A chair was pushed up to the desk, but not flush with it. I slowly approached the window. Outside, the twilight was thickening. Through the kitchen window the light was on, and I could make out a glass with half-drunk tea on the table. Then I examined the desk. On the thick layer of dust someone, probably with a finger, had written, "I see you." The inscription was fresh, otherwise dust would have settled over it. A nameless dread slid through my chest and my skin prickled with goosebumps. I grabbed the chair to steady myself and looked around once more. On the floor were only my footprints. It was getting very dark and, for some reason, rather cool. Though at first I had noticed the heating worked in the apartment. A clear thought formed in my head. Leave. Now. I pushed a chair under the table, back toward the door, and on the threshold turned and almost ran through the corridor and the hallway. Outside, someone was watching closely. Bursting onto the lit landing, I came face to face with an old woman peeking from the next apartment. She was visibly startled by my emerging from the abandoned flat. She carelessly hadn't shut her door. She stared at me with her mouth open. I greeted her and said I was looking at the apartment as a potential purchase. She covered herself with the door, leaving only her nose in the doorway, and said the apartment had been for sale for a long time. I asked at random what had happened to the last tenants. It heard there'd been some tragedy in that flat. The old woman retreated further inside and shouted that she didn't know. There hadn't been any tenants for a couple of years besides. Her stew was burning on the stove. Then she slammed the door shut. From the sound behind the door, I realized she was peeking at me through the peephole I guessed. She was probably reaching for the phone to call the police. I hurried away from the entrance and returned home. The mysterious silhouette was no longer visible. I drew the curtains and fell into thought. The next evening the figure in the window was gone, and it didn't return in the following days. I hung around the window, but saw nothing new. The opposite window was impenetrable. Maybe I imagined the whole thing, I thought. Sometimes my thoughts returned to what it experienced. A year passed. To be honest, I'd mostly forgotten the story. But yesterday, I came home early from work and decided to have tea. After the kettle boiled, I looked up at the windows and didn't immediately realize that those very windows were lit. My frightening adventure flashed through my mind, and I began to peer greedily, tearfully even, into the glowing rectangles of windows. I saw people moving there, turning lights on and off. It seemed someone had moved into the apartment. The windows still didn't have curtains. I counted at least 3 silhouettes, probably an ordinary average family. I sat and didn't know whether I should go to them and tell the story, presenting it in the best traditions of Hollywood horror. Of course they wouldn't believe me, and if they did, what good would it do? I would only plant unpleasant suspicions in them, a sense that something unknown and frightening was nearby. Or maybe I'm just a paranoid man with an overactive imagination, and it's not worth butting into decent people's lives with my unproven tales.